The bills are paid. The emergency fund exists, a real number in a real account, not the theoretical figure you used to write on notepads at midnight and tell yourself count it. The debt is either gone or close enough that you no longer feel it pressing against you when you wake up. The income is steady. The investments are finally actually happening. And yet, you wake up at 3 a.m. with something you can't name. Not a nightmare, not a specific worry, more like a pressure, somewhere between your ribs and your throat that lands on you before you've even fully surfaced from sleep. You reach for your phone, you check the account. The number is fine. The number is good, actually. And nothing changed. And somehow, looking at it doesn't help. You've arrived at the place you spent years trying to reach, and the arrival feels not how you expected it to feel. There's something still running in you that hasn't gotten the message, a system that's still scanning, still braced, still waiting for the thing that no longer seems to be coming. You can't quite explain it, and you're not sure you're allowed to say it out loud, because from the outside, you look like someone who has it handled. Before anything else, let me be direct about what this is not. This is not ingratitude. This is not a sign that you haven't done enough, or that something is fundamentally wrong with you, or that people with real financial problems would be right to dismiss what you're experiencing. You took your situation seriously. That's not a small thing. Most people don't. They ignore, defer, minimize, and then one day find themselves in a hole they don't understand. You did something different. You paid attention. You made changes that cost you something: comfort, time, the relief of spending without thinking. You tracked things. You restructured things. You sat with uncomfortable numbers and stayed in the room with them instead of closing the tab. And the financial vigilance you carried through all of that constant low-grade monitoring, it made complete sense. When the stakes are real, alertness is the right response. Your brain was doing exactly what a brain is supposed to do when resources feel uncertain. It was watching, calculating, protecting. That vigilance had a function. It probably helped you get here. The issue isn't that your brain developed that response. The issue is what happens when the thing the response was trained to protect you from disappears. Because the brain doesn't just look around, confirm the coast is clear, and quietly stand down. That's not how years of practiced vigilance works. The nervous system doesn't read the spreadsheet and update accordingly. It keeps running. And that's the part nobody warns you about when they tell you to get your finances together. Here's the thing that almost no one says clearly. Financial anxiety is not always about finances. It starts there. It is genuinely, functionally about money in the beginning. The threat is real. The response is proportionate. The vigilance earns its keep. But over months and years of practicing that response, something changes at a level much deeper than your balance sheet. The anxiety stops being a signal and starts being a habit. And habits are indifferent to whether their original purpose still exists. This is the quiet betrayal of arriving where you were trying to go. You did the work, the external problem is resolved, and the internal alarm is still going off, not because it found something new, but because going off is what it knows how to do. The alarm isn't malfunctioning, it's performing the only function it was ever trained to perform. Here's the specific shape of what happened. For years, every time you engaged with your financial life, every time you opened an account, reviewed a statement, calculated a balance, thought about the future, your body produced a particular physical response: tension in the shoulders, a tightening in the chest, a faint but familiar flood of cortisol that you eventually stopped registering because it was just the baseline. Month after month,
Your nervous system practiced that pattern. It became automatic, below the level of conscious thought. Your brain, over time, began to associate money, even the thought of money, even the act of checking, with a mild but persistent state of threat. And then the external circumstances changed, the numbers improved, the actual threat receded. But the brain doesn't update its emotional associations just because the conditions change. The wiring is the wiring. The association remains. The pattern keeps running. You are not experiencing anxiety because something is wrong with your finances. You are experiencing anxiety because something is right with them, and your nervous system doesn't know what to do with that.
The mechanism has a specific, traceable shape, and once you see it clearly, you'll start recognizing it in almost everything you do around money. It begins with hypervigilance, the monitoring state the brain enters when resources feel uncertain or threatened. This state is adaptive. When there is a real problem, scanning for threats, tracking every movement, staying mentally prepared for the next bad thing, that is the appropriate response. It serves a genuine function. But here is what hypervigilance does over time that most people don't anticipate. It begins to feel like safety, not the outcomes of the monitoring, not the stable number or the funded account. The act of monitoring itself starts to feel like the thing that's keeping you okay. The watching, the checking, the calculating, the worry that isn't quite worry but isn't quite not either. The brain makes a deeply embedded association. As long as I am vigilant, things are under control, which means the absence of vigilance, calm, ease, genuine undefendedness registers not as safety, but a gap, a strange, uncomfortable opening where the protection used to be. And brains are suspicious of unfamiliar states. So when the vigilance has nothing to hold on to, when the account is fine, the investments are fine, it looks at the market. If the market seems manageable, it calculates job security. If the job feels stable, it starts modeling what happens if it doesn't stay that way. If that scenario doesn't gain traction, it moves to inflation, healthcare costs, aging parents, the cost of everything that might go wrong a decade from now, and around it goes. This is the loop. The absence of threat creates discomfort. Discomfort triggers scanning. Scanning occasionally lands on something, a number, a headline, a hypothetical, that gives the vigilance something to grip. That grip temporarily calms the nervous system because the system is back in its practiced mode. But the grip dissolves. The absence returns. The loop restarts. What's important to see here is that this loop is not irrational. It is a perfectly logical consequence of having practiced a particular response for years, and it feels virtuous. That is the part that keeps it invisible. The monitoring feels like responsibility. The vigilance feels like the exact quality that got you out of the situation you were in. Letting it go feels like what careless people do. People who haven't been paying attention, who one day find themselves surprised by something they should have seen coming. So you keep it up, not because there's a fire, but because the body has practiced reaching for the fire extinguisher so many times that putting it down feels reckless. You solved the problem. Your body didn't. This is not a money problem. This is a nervous system that learned one mode of operating and has not yet been shown another. This is what smart money sabotage exists to surface. Not the obvious decisions, not the bad investments or missed opportunities, but the quiet internal patterns of intelligent, self-aware people who are by every external measure doing it right.
This shows up in ways that are almost embarrassingly ordinary, which is exactly why most people absorb them without ever naming them as anything. There's the person who set a savings target, hit it, then moved the target. The original number was 3 months of expenses. When that felt insufficient, it became 6. Now they're thinking about 12. Not because of any change in their actual risk, not because anything happened, but because each time they arrive at the number, the feeling of safety they expected to feel doesn't materialize. And so the brain concludes the number must not be high enough yet. The finish line keeps moving not because of logic. It moves because the finish line was never where the feeling was going to come from. There's the person who checks their portfolio every morning before doing anything else. Not to make decisions, not because they're planning any moves, just to look. And on the mornings when the market is slightly down, even in a way that at their time horizon is genuinely irrelevant, something falls in their stomach that takes hours to metabolize. They won't sell. They're not panicking in any visible way, but the number colored the morning. The day started with a body that was slightly more braced than it needed to be, and that brace never fully released. There's the couple who paid off the last debt and went out to dinner to celebrate. They ordered something good, they clinked glasses, they smiled at each other, and then almost immediately one of them said, "We should start thinking about the next thing." Not from excitement, from the particular discomfort of having no financial problem actively in process. The silence of being okay felt somehow like falling behind, like the absence of a problem was itself a kind of negligence. There's the person who grew up watching money be a source of panic in their home, who carries that in the body the way all early absorbed things are carried, not as a thought but as a texture, who now earns more than their parents ever did, has more stability than they ever imagined having, and still feels a particular tightening when they spend on something that isn't strictly necessary. A dinner out, a weekend away, something for themselves. The purchase happens, but the enjoyment is taxed, not by guilt exactly, by something older than guilt. A voice that sounds like prudence, but originates somewhere else entirely. And then there is the version that is, in some ways, the most costly of all, because it is the most invisible. You're sitting somewhere you worked years to afford, a trip you planned, a dinner you earned, a morning with nothing required of you, and you're still doing the math, still somewhere else. The numbers aren't on the table, but they're somewhere in the room. There's a part of your mind that didn't make it onto the plane, that stayed behind, calculating, bracing, managing a future that isn't happening yet. The place is real. You're not quite there. They describe their financial situation accurately, stable, improving, solid, and all of it is true. And the low hum of unease is also true. Holding both at once is a tax that shows up on no statement. The cost of this pattern is not a crisis. That's precisely what makes it so easy to carry without ever fully accounting for it. It doesn't appear in one moment. It accumulates as a low ceiling, a persistent sense that the version of life you are working toward, where you feel the ease you've earned, where the present moment doesn't keep evacuating itself into hypothetical futures, is always one milestone away, always just past the next number, the next year of stability, the next thing secured before it's okay to fully arrive. And that milestone keeps appearing because it was never the milestone that held the feeling, and the feeling itself has become unfamiliar enough that the brain isn't sure it would recognize it if it arrived. The cost shows up in the relationships that form around this pattern. Partners who sense after years that no achievement ever quite lands, that there's always a new thing absorbing the anxiety that the last solved thing was supposed to dissolve. Children who grow up in homes where money carries a particular charge, not because it's scarce, but because the adults managing it never seem fully relaxed about it. The emotional climate around finances isn't determined by the balance, it's determined by the nervous system of the person managing them. There are friendships over time where people notice something they can't quite name, a quality of tension in you around things that, by any reasonable measure, you've handled. And because no one knows how to say that kindly, no one says it.
It becomes a quiet fact of knowing you. And then there is the body. A nervous system that has spent years in monitoring mode doesn't return to baseline because the spreadsheet improved. Some people discover this only when they start tracking their own physiology. Devices like the Oura Ring, which measures heart rate variability and recovery scores daily, often reveal that the body is still running in a low-grade stress response long after the financial threat has passed. The numbers on that dashboard tell a story the bank statements don't. The disrupted sleep, the jaw that's clenched by morning, the digestion that never quite settles. The body holds its training longer than you think it will. And here is the cost that is strangest and most worth sitting with. The vigilance that once moved you forward, that organized your behavior, focused your attention, produced the discipline that changed your situation, is now costing you more than it's earning. It used to be fuel. Now it's friction. The same internal system that got you out of the financial situation you were in is quietly extracting a toll from the life you built on the other side of it. You spent years doing the work so that you could have a different relationship with your life. Financially, that work is largely done. The relationship hasn't changed yet.
Think about the last time you felt genuinely, physically still about your financial situation. Not satisfied with the numbers, not reassured, but actually untensed, not holding anything, not mid-calculation, not already thinking about the next thing. Take a moment with that. If that moment is hard to locate, if it's been months or years, or if you're realizing it may never have arrived, even once, even in the most stable stretch of your financial life, notice that. Not as a judgment, as information. Read these slowly. Notice where something shifts in you. When your finances are genuinely stable, the feeling that comes most easily is not peace, it's vigilance about protecting what you have. There is a number in your mind that represents safety. You've reached it at least once. You raised it. You find it easier to metabolize bad financial news than to let good financial news actually settle. The bad news goes somewhere familiar. The good news sits strangely. At some point, recently or years ago, you had this version of the thought, I should feel better than I do. And then you went looking for a reason why you didn't, found something small to justify the vigilance, and it felt like relief. Spending on yourself, even things you can clearly and comfortably afford, carries a particular texture, not quite guilt, something that lives just next to guilt without being it. You are more comfortable with an active problem than with the absence of one. Problems give your attention something to organize around. Stability feels at times like a held breath, like waiting. You check financial things, accounts, markets, numbers of any kind, not primarily to gather information or make decisions. You check them because something in you needs to check them. And the relief is real, and it lasts about as long as it takes to close the app. None of these describe carelessness. Every one of them describes someone who takes their financial life seriously, who cares about doing it right. They also describe someone whose nervous system never received the signal that it was allowed to set down the weight.
What changes when you can see this not as a flaw, not as a financial issue, not as something to solve or optimize, but simply as a pattern that formed for real reasons, that served a real function during a period when vigilance was exactly what the situation called for?
A pattern that has, in the way of all deeply practiced responses, outlasted the conditions that shaped it, and one that will not dissolve the moment you understand it intellectually. The brain doesn't work on that timeline. The nervous system doesn't reorganize around insight alone. But something shifts when you can watch the loop without being entirely inside it. When you notice the pull to check the account and recognize it as the pattern doing what the pattern does, not as evidence that something needs checking. When the 3 a.m. activation arrives and a part of you can say, even quietly, "This is my nervous system running its practiced routine, not my financial life sending me a genuine distress signal." That gap between the trigger and the automatic response is the only place where anything different becomes possible. It is not comfortable at first. The pull to fill it with a number, with a calculation, with something to monitor will be compelling. The nervous system will make a persuasive case for why staying alert is the responsible thing to do. And some of the time, it will be right. Vigilance is not the enemy. Unconscious vigilance, the kind that runs regardless of current reality, that monitors out of habit rather than necessity, that is what quietly costs you. Seeing the difference between the two is not a small shift. For some people, it turns out to be the only one that was left to make. You did something most people don't do. You took the financial situation seriously. You stayed in the discomfort of changing it. You made the choices that cost something, and you followed through on them. And the numbers on the other side of all that are real. That is yours. The anxiety that remains is not evidence that you haven't done enough. It is simply the nervous system on its own slower timeline, the body holding its training a little longer than the problem held on. The alarm that hasn't yet received the news that the emergency is over. Not because the news isn't true, but because the alarm runs on something deeper than information. There's nothing to fix tonight, no next step to take, no system to implement, no target to set. Just one question worth sitting with, gently, without urgency, as something to return to rather than resolve. What would it feel like to let the alarm go quiet? Not to stop caring, not to stop being the person who pays attention, just for a moment to let the room be still, and to notice in that stillness that nothing falls apart.